Talking Over Minorities, Ben Franklin and Bob Dylan by Devin Welch. In the summer of 2020, there was great civil unrest, and this was a jumping off point for a lot of white people to put their feet in their mouths. And a perfect example of this was when Vulture highlighted in a screenshot below that on Blackout Tuesday, in quotation marks, the Black Lives Matter hashtag was flooded by empty black boxes. And it ruined the hashtag for the day. It impeded a lot of people's abilities to get information over Instagram. White people can be very tone deaf when it comes to conversations surrounding race, to the point where people of color will just not talk about race to some white people. For instance, Rennie Edo Lodge wrote for The Guardian that amid every conversation about nice white people feeling silenced by conversations about race, there's a sort of ironic and glaring lack of understanding or empathy for those of us who have been visibly marked out as different for our entire lives and live the consequences. It stems from white people's never questioned entitlement, I suppose. White people can be tone deaf. Continued. However, the issues that surround white people lacking perspective blurs a bit when you look at people who actually use empathy in their art in the hopes of humanizing minorities. The two people that I'm talking about are Ben Franklin and Bob Dylan, who made remarks concerning the savages of North America from NAAL 462 to 466, and Bob Dylan's song Only a Pawn in Their Game from his album The Times They Are a Changin' from 1964. Remarks concerning the savages of North America. So, in essence, Ben Franklin tries to humanize Indians by explaining their customs and talking about how they weren't necessarily worse than white people, but they were different. For instance, he says on 462, savages we call them because their manners differ from ours, which we think the perfection of civility. They think the same of theirs. He stresses the entire essay that their civility is similar to ours. It's a focal point. And he gives an anecdote about Virginians coming to the Iroquois Nation, talking about taking some of their men, educating them, and sending them back. And the Iroquois men sit on it for a day, come back and say no, and talk about how some of their customs don't carry over. Franklin quotes the speaker as saying several of our young people were formerly brought up at the colleges of northern provinces. They were instructed in all your sciences, but when they came back to us, they were bad runners, ignorant of every means of living in the woods. They were totally good for nothing. NAAL 463. So they make a point of showing that savages weren't necessarily rude, that Indians weren't necessarily just without any tact. They merely acted differently from us. While Only a Pawn in Their Game was talking over black people about civil rights leader Medgar being assassinated, it talks very little about black people themselves, but it talks about poor white people and their manipulation by the upper class. It talks about how instead of coming together to fight against the upper class, they talk about fighting against each other. He says, "You've got more than the blacks, don't complain." Speaking from the perspective of the upper class talking down to the white people. The similarities between the texts. In their day, the groups that they were talking about had very little sway. They were both second-class citizens, and neither were fully enfranchised at the time. And they also made their pieces in ways that could be easily mass-produced. Franklin just had a short letter, while Dylan had a song on an album. And the difference is Franklin tries to humanize Indians through his anecdotes, while Dylan tries to speak truth to power and tries to make more of a class struggle than a race struggle. But they both try to do the same thing. That they tried to discuss how black people deserve better from society. They merely go about it in completely different ways. In conclusion, you need to approach situations like this with a lot of nuance, but it seems as though black people black people and Native Americans were elevated through the use of their platform and their privilege to be able to broadcast their ideas that freely. And while black people weren't silent at the time, like Nina Simone's influential protest song Mississippi Goddamn coming out the same year as Only a Pawn in Their Game, and Segoya Watha speaking before Ben Franklin, page 436 of the NAAL, talking about his speech being able to be translated and spread. They weren't silent, but they were merely amplified by Ben Franklin and Bob Dylan in these situations. That's all. Thank you.